have to record. You either have a young dove or an older dove. What happens if you can't even afford that? Person doesn't even have money to buy a bird for the temple. The Torah tells us that he can even bring a flower offering, and we'll learn all about the different kind of flower offerings in today's Chumash. So join me as we study and learn about these different things in today's Chumash. For the next 10, 15 minutes, we'll learn inside. Actually, I'm going to show you a picture of the temple. I want to go to the sanctuary. Look at the screen here and you'll see this is an overview of what the sanctuary looked like. I'm going to zoom in here for you guys and show you this is an overview. Right here, as we've been learning in our class, is the Holy of Holies where the Ark was kept. Right over here was where the sanctuary, where the menorah was kept, and the table of bread, the inner altar, and outside that door, as we learned in the previous Chumash, the previous week, there was a large altar, a large mizbeach right outside the front door. And the Kohen would bring up the animals onto the altar, and he would burn the animals that he would burn on the altar. And on the side, we're going to learn about right next to the ramp. This is the big ramp going up to the altar. We're going to learn about the ashes. There was a pile of ashes there, which going to reference, which is going to throw out some of the stuff. Very interesting what he does and does not burn. Something fascinating, which you'll learn about in the sacrifices of today's Chumash. Here is like a close-up of it. You see on the side of the ramp, here's a Kohen. Who is our Kohen? Yehuda. Hopefully Yehuda is here, our token Kohen in our class. Yehuda would take the ashes and sometimes take it off the altar, come down, and Yehuda would bring it to the burnt pile, the burnt ashes next to the ramp, next to the altar. Here, by the way, we spoke yesterday, they would cut up the animal, the burnt offering in yesterday's Chumash into 10 pieces. You see, there's a table here, and they're cutting, and there's stuff going on. That was next to the altar where some of the stuff would take place. Let's see inside the text of the Torah of today's Chumash. We'll see it inside today's portion. Let's do this together. Okay. I think I need to zoom out a little bit. Too much zoomed in here. Okay. So today's Chumash, let's learn about the two animal sacrifices that the poorer people would bring because they couldn't afford a large one. And if he brings a bird, if his bird is a sacrifice because he can't afford a larger sacrifice, every animal has its designated. From the larger animal, you bring a bull. From the smaller animals, if you want to represent the smaller animals, you bring a goat or a sheep. What about the birds? What about the fowl? The bird you bring to the temple as a sacrifice would either be a turtle dove or a young dove. Now, the Torah, from that should bring your sacrifice. And Rashi gives us the regulations. What the Torah is telling us is allowed to be brought as we're starting off the laws of sacrifices, what is good and what's not good. And he tells you, unlike the animals that we spoke about yesterday, that they have to be unblemished animals, you have to bring God a good gift. If a bird is a little bit blemished, it's okay to bring such a bird to Hashem as a gift. However, even though the poor man's bringing even a blemished bird to the temple, he cannot be missing a whole limb. That's already too embarrassing. You can't bring Hashem a gift that's a bird that's missing a limb. So imagine someone would go get a cheap discount in the store to buy a really cheap bird and bring a cheap bird with him to the temple, and it's no good. So yesterday I used people in our classes, but everyone, Baruch Hashem should bless them. I can't use people as analogies, but let's make up a guy. His name is Chaim. So Chaim can't afford a lot. He goes to the store. He sees on sale. There's a bird on sale. It's missing a limb, missing a wing. I don't know, missing a foot. And he says, "Oh, I can bring that." No, you have to at least buy a bird for Hashem, even though you're bringing the cheaper offering, because you can't afford more. But still, it cannot be missing a whole limb. That's not respectful to bring that on the temple. Now, Rashi tells us that about the age here of a bird, of how it grows up. So when a bird is very little, he says it doesn't have the reddish color. As this turtle dove gets older, it starts getting red. And then, as I showed you in the picture when it started the class, it's very beautiful colors. Rashi tells us today that, Rashi tells us in today's class that in-between stage, as the turtle dove's wings are starting to turn red, as the turtle dove's wings are starting to become and turn red, those are like in between a baby, a young turtle dove, and an older one. Though not allowed to be bought as a sacrifice. It either has to be young or it has to be old. It can't be, I'm not sure why, but it can't be in between. And what does he do? The Kohen brings it to the altar, that big altar that I showed you in the picture. And here he does something which sounds very gruesome, but I'm going to explain to you why. When I was teaching the mitzvah class, I'm going to explain to you why. It's going to sound weird, but maybe I'll explain to you a fascinating reason that I heard on this thing. Unlike the other sacrifices, which they would take a knife and slaughter it, this bird, the Kohen would take his nail. He had a very long, he had to grow his thumbnail long and very sharp. And he would, as it's a small bird, these birds are very small, he would stick his nail into the back of the head. It would die instantly. He would slaughter it from the back of the neck, and it would go through the spine of this little bird and through the esophagus and the windpipe. It would be a second, wouldn't feel any pain. It would be something that's done very quick. And you burn it on the altar. And this, of course, is something that bothers people when they learn this sometimes. By the way, this is one of the cases that could bother. Why would the Torah want this to be done in this fashion, this kind of slaughtering this bird in this way? It's done very quickly. And I saw, it was something that bothers regular people when they study this Chumash, but I saw something very interesting. Being that it is a poor man's bird, the Kohen, it's very embarrassing for this guy. Everyone's coming with their cow, with their bull, or with their big animals. And this poor guy is coming with his little offering. Also, you know what? On top of everything, he has to go back to his family. He doesn't have a lot of time to spend. So they don't want the Kohen to go start looking for a knife. The Kohen does it very quickly. He has to be so skilled, the Kohen, to work in the temple. Yehuda, in our class, would have to grow his nails, his thumbnail very long. I don't know if Yehuda's on yet. And he would have to be so skilled that he doesn't even need to look for a knife. 2 minutes. He takes the guy's burnt offering, he slaughters it. He says, thank you very much. You could go home. So it's one of the fascinating reasons, perhaps we don't really understand fully the reasons for the stuff, but that's one of the reasons this animal was actually slaughtered using the Kohen's nail, done in a very swift, quick way, to allow this guy not to be embarrassed, perhaps, of the sacrifice if he didn't want to hang around, that he had to bring the poor man's sacrifice. And if he wanted to go home and he had to run home, they had to learn how to do it very quickly. Very interesting idea behind this mitzvah. Now, one of the main parts of sacrifices, we said yesterday, when you collected from the animal, Yehuda would take the jug of blood that would come, the first blood that would come out of the neck of the animal, and they would sprinkle it on the altar. Now, this bird is a tiny little bird. There's not a lot of blood there. So, sprinkling the blood on the altar is one of the main ways that the sacrifice is done. So how would they have blood from this little tiny bird sprinkled on the altar? So v'nimtza dam yal kiram mizbeach, they would actually take the bird itself and squeeze the bird that's dead and have a little bit of its blood go around on the altar, be squeezed on the altar, not in a cup. Very interesting. Was done very different than the other animals. You would just squeeze the bird and the blood would come out and it would be squeezed against the altar, and that's how the blood would come out on the altar. Very fascinating. Just to go over, why do we put blood on the altar? Blood is part of the passion, that's part of the animal, and therefore to show the person again that they can act with passion, they can act with anger in an unhealthy way. They have to be human, they have to control themselves. That's part of the reason for the things that we are doing over here. Very interesting. Continuing right along. There's a fascinating Rashi here. Now, that whole bird is burnt on the altar, like we learned yesterday. However, you take out its stomach, its innards. What do you do with it? What do you do? Don't burn the whole bird on the altar. Take out the stomach. Take out the place before it goes to the bathroom, where it collects inside the bird, of this little tiny bird. Do surgery. Remove the stomach. Do not put the stomach on the altar. Don't put it there. So what should you do with it? You're going to put it right next to the altar, that ramp. Remember, I showed you the picture next to the ramp. There was like a pit, a place there full of ashes. Put the stomach in the ashes. Don't put it on the altar. And put it in the place of the ashes. Now the question becomes, Rashi shares a very fascinating reason. Why do we not want the stomach of the bird on the altar? The animal, the goat, the sheep, the bull, all that, we burnt the whole thing out. Before we put the stomach on, we washed off the animal. We washed it out. We took it to the water and we washed it out so it's nice and clean, and we stuck it on the altar. How come by the bird we're cutting out the stomach? And Rashi says something fascinating. He says that birds fly around to other people's yards and they eat food and they might steal. So let's say the store owner owns this bird, and this bird that he owns comes back to the turtle dove cage. Meanwhile, he flew next door. Someone was having a barbecue or something else. The bird ate food from somebody else. So in fact, the bird is stealing from another person. Your bird flew out and stole from somebody else's food. Now, God forbid, we don't want to serve stolen food on the altar. That would be, here the whole point of the altar is to do a mitzvah. We don't want to serve a stolen food on the altar. Very fascinating reason. So therefore, before the bird goes on the altar, you have to cut out the stomach and burn it not on the altar, next to the altar, because the stolen food should not come out of the altar. Fascinating idea behind this mitzvah of cutting out the stomach, unlike all the other animals. Okay. And you then rip the bird in half, open it up to get ready to burn. You don't put it on as a whole bird. You open the bird from the back. Rashi says, with your hands, the kohen would do it all real quickly, so this poor man could get back to work. He could watch his animal be burnt on the altar and go back to work. With his hands, he rips open the bird. And the kohen burns it on the altar, on the wood, that's on the fire. This is a burnt offering, pleasing smelling offering to Hashem. So the animal is burnt because we're discussing fully burnt animals. Other sacrifices, the kohen will get part of the steak and the owners will get part of the meat. No, but this offering is we want you to take your money and burn it. Give it to Hashem, not to benefit from it, to show Hashem that I'm doing something that's hard for me because I want to do what's right, and I have to learn to stop acting like an animal and to start acting more my human, to take control, which is the reason why people sin. It's because they're acting more like an animal. Now, we burn the feathers on the altar. Rashi asks, that's not a sweet smelling thing. That doesn't smell good. Why would you burn the bird with the feathers on the altar? At least get rid of the feathers. And why are you calling it in our verse sweet smelling? And Rashi says two very important things. Number one, imagine this poor man. All he could do is bring a little bird. You're going to take off the feathers. You know what the bird will look like without feathers? He'll look like kind of gift this guy gave, a terrible gift. He gave a bird without this tiny little thing. So don't take the feathers off, even though it's going to smell bad. Put the bird on together with the feathers. Very interesting. And to add to that, he says it's a pleasing smell before Hashem. Why would we describe something that smells bad as something that smells good? And here's the point. It doesn't matter what you give. This poor man, you might say, oh, by the guy who brought the big bull sacrifice, he went to give a nice donation. That was pleasing before Hashem. But imagine if the Torah wouldn't say that this bird is a pleasing smelling offering. You know how bad the poor man would feel with all he could afford to bring? Therefore, we leave the feathers on and we say it's pleasing smelling before Hashem because Hashem appreciates it so much that he did what he could afford, and therefore he loves and appreciates what the person did. And when we rip the bird open, the animal, we would chop it up into 10 different pieces to burn well, but we don't want to chop up this bird because could you imagine how tiny it's going to look and how bad this poor man will feel? So therefore, we leave the wings on, and when we split it in half, but we keep the at least by the skin, by the feathers, we keep it together, and we put it onto the altar and we burn this person's offering. And finally, we'll finish off today's class. What if a person is so poor that they can't even afford a bird? They can't afford a bull, and they can't even afford a goat or a sheep, and they can't even afford as a sacrifice. They can't even afford a bird, this little bird. Well, there's still a donation he can bring on the altar, and that is out of flour. So at least he's not burning his animal, because the whole point is, listen, get out of your animal. So if you could afford a bird, at least bring a bird representing sacrificing the animal within you. If you can't even afford that, then at least bring from the vegetation and take some of your own property, of your flour, and burn that, representing all the vegetation in the world. And listen what he says, a beautiful Rashi here. When a soul wants to bring a gift to God, a soul, calls this poor man who can't bring anything else, he calls him a soul. And Rashi tells us, why is he calling this poor man a soul? Fascinating, he's saying, because the guy, could you imagine, the guy can't even afford a bird. He literally takes flour from his kitchen, goes to his kitchen, he takes flour, or he buys a little bit of flour, and he brings that as an offering to Hashem. Hashem appreciates that even more than the wealthy person's, in a way, more than the wealthy person's bowl, because he's literally taking food off his table in order to bring his sacrifice that he wants to bring to Hashem. Hashem says, I consider it like he gave his own soul. That's how much Hashem appreciates the poor man who could only afford flour. Hashem, in a sense, appreciates that in a way more than anything else that was given. Let's go on. Karba mincha Hashem as a meal offering. So if a soulful man wants to bring at least something, he wants to bring a flour offering to Hashem, you always got to bring the highest quality. Meaning, if it's flour, it's got to be good flour. You can't bring grade A flour. You can't bring cheap flour. You bring a gift that has to be a nice gift. Your carbonite. Now, to make it look nicer, part of the gift, you put oil. Yatzak Hashem, and he pours oil on it. And he gets a spice. He calls it frankincense, takes the spice, and he puts the spice on the altar. Now, But how does this work? So how exactly does this work? Because now we have a problem. So what do we burn on the altar? In fact, you're not going to take a whole bowl of flour with oil all over it, poured over it, with frankincense, a spice on the side, and put the whole thing on the altar. You're going to scoop out. The Kohen will do this as I'm doing with my fingers. We'll take his 3 fingers as I'm doing. He will scoop into the flour and oil, not touch the frankincense. The frankincense doesn't go now on the altar. Scoop out with 3 fingers. Take his thumb and his pinky and get any leftover flowers on the side out. He will take that fistful, put it on the altar. Yehuda, our Kohen, we'll do what I'm doing now. Scoop out with 3 fingers, oil and flour, and go to the altar and put it on the altar for it to burn. He will then come back. He'll take the frankincense, all of the frankincense out, put it on the altar and burn that whole thing to Hashem. What's he going to do with the whole rest of the bowl of the flour and the oil? They're going to eat it. The Kohanim, as Hashem's messengers, are going to eat it, and this will bring forgiveness for the Jewish people. Beautiful, very interesting. So let's go on and wrap it up or see what you do. So if you want to bring a flour offering, you don't even have to cook it. The poor man can simply go get flour and oil and frankincense and bring it, a bowl of it, to the temple and say, Hashem, here is my gift to you, God. I want to bring it to you, Hashem. And the Kohen, Yehuda, our Kohen, will scoop it out and put it on the altar. Now, here's where he describes the scooping. The Behavias ben Aaron, Kohanim, Aaron and his sons, Yehuda, our Kohen, will do the scooping. The kamatz is called kimitza. Kamatz will scoop it out, misham. Will come to a fistful. Misalto, mishamna, from the fine flour and from the oil. Al kol veinasa will not touch the. He will not touch the frankincense. He will remove that separately. And the kohen will sacrifice a remembrance from the flour and mizbech on the altar as a fire, a please-smelling offering to Hashem. Very interesting. Okay. What happens to the rest of that whole bowl left over in flour and oil? Aaron and Levana for Aaron and his sons. Will be holy to Hashem. So let's just go over, just to recap here. Each animal has either a whole or part of it brought on the altar. Remember, the bull, the whole thing's burnt on the altar, besides the skin. A little bit of blood sprinkled on the altar. Same thing with the goat and the sheep. With the bird, how are you going to get blood in a cup? You're going to actually squeeze the blood out and then throw the whole bird, burn it on the altar, besides the stomach. What about the flour? It can't work the same way. You're not exactly sprinkling. How are you sprinkling on the altar? You're not going to, there's no blood there. You're just going to scoop out a scoop and put it on the altar. The leftovers, is for Aaron and his children, and it has to be treated as holy of holies. They have to eat it in a very holy way, and that brings sacrifice and forgiveness to the person they brought it for. And if they want to bring me'afataner, but what if the poor man says, I want to bring a challah. I don't want to bring flour, a big bowl of flour. I want to cook something for Hashem. It's actually very interesting. Imagine you want to, in your kitchen, you want to make a dish for God. Fine, there's 4 different ways you could cook for Hashem. And we're going to talk about 2 of them today and 2 of them tomorrow. So he says, you want to bring a bread, a loaf sacrifice to Hashem. Everything has to be matzah. But there's 2 kinds of matzah, even though we know when we eat matzah, our matzah that we get, I know Chabad gives out matzah, it's very crunchy, very crunchy, like he calls it a wafer. It's like a wafer. It's very crunchy and thin. But by the way, because we don't put any oil in that matzah, even though it's cooked within 18 minutes, one of the ways that would make this matzah more juicy is that besides them just putting in flour and water, if they would dump a bunch of oil inside there, it would make it very juicy, more like a cake-like taste, more soft, more not so crunchy, more soft. Now, everything in the temple had to be baked within 18 minutes. It couldn't become chametz. It couldn't become leavened. So the first option here is make a oil saturated soaked matzah, so it's almost even going to be like a challah, and you have to make 10 of each. Rashi tells us later. So you go and you bake 10. First option 1 is to make a kind of a matzah challah, meaning matzah with oil, and saturated with a lot of oil, making it like nice rich taste of when things have oil in it. Or you could make it exactly like the matzah we have today. Don't put any oil in. Put in flour, water, cook it within 18 minutes, exactly like we make matzahs today, but everything has to have oil. So what you'll do is you'll pour oil on the matzah after it's being baked. So that is a little bit about the 2 kinds of matzah. There's another 2 ways to bring cooked flour to Hashem. So we already have 3 sacrifices. Fine flour, not cooked. Just bring a bowl of flour to the temple with oil and frankincense, or cook it with oil, or cook it without oil. With oil, it's called like loaves, and without oil, only when the oil goes on after, it's called wafers. Now you're going to ask me a question, but the flour offering, the kohen scooped out of the flour and put some of it on the altar. How does he put a loaves of bread on the altar? What, he takes a whole matzah and he puts 10 matzahs on the altar? No, he'll take the matzahs, he'll crush it up into pieces. You ever did that on Pesach and stuck it in the soup? He'll take a matzah, crush it up into little pieces, scoop it out of the new pieces that he has, and he'll put that on top of the mizbeach, on top of the altar. The mincha machvas karbanecha says one more, almost done here. What if your meal offering is made in a pan? There's 2 kinds of pan options. We all know we have at home. There's the shallow pan, and there is the thick frying pan. What's the difference between when you make schnitzel, right? When I make schnitzel at home, I fill it up with oil, put in like a little bit, good amount of oil to fry the schnitzel in, versus when I make eggs, I just take Pam and I sprinkle a little bit of oil on. What happens is that the oil when I do it with Pam, just a thin layer of oil, the oil gets hot. It doesn't really go in the eggs. Doesn't taste good if the oil goes in the eggs. You only want it to fry the eggs, not to go in the eggs. You want it just not to stick to the pan. So what happens is the flour you would put in doesn't really get soaked with oil. But if I deep fry it, it becomes like donuts, right? We all know those round Hanukkah donuts the donuts that people have. When you put it into a thick thing of oil, it comes nice and juicy. So there's 2 other kinds of matzahs you could bring to the temple. Either deep fried in a deep frying pan, or shallow fried in a regular frying pan, the same way we make eggs. So those are the 5 total kinds of ways of making challah. Let me just repeat. For the poor man who can't afford even a bird, he can either bring flour, he can bring what we want to call matzah loaves. That means you mixed in a lot of oil to it. He could be matzah wafers, meaning exactly like the matzahs we eat today on Pesach. He could bring it deep fried, or he could bring it shallow fried in a frying pan. And then, verse 6, pasais oisa pitim, he will crush it up into little pizzas. Yitzakta lashaman, and he will pour oil on top of it because he didn't have the crushing up before. Minchahi, it is a meal offering to Hashem, and that is the end, my friends, of today's chumash. We'll leave it over here. Our commitment from 12 to 12:30 to 1 half hour. Those who have to go, you fulfill your commitment. Anyone has any questions?